I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar on cybersecurity. We have a wonderful audience of professionals from compliance, risk, training, IT, and operations on the phone, and we hope you come away today with some really good strategies and best practices for how to mitigate risk of cyber attacks through creating an effective incident response plan. We really want you to learn more about some tools and techniques to manage cybersecurity. I am Frances Hops, Channel Director for OnCourse Learning. OnCourse Learning is a premier provider of financial services training provided through such well-known brands such as Banker's Edge, Digital University, Training Pro, and Pro Schools. Joining me today is Mr. Craig Hoffman and Mr. Anthony Sherritt, both partners at Baker Hostetler, who will be our webinar presenters. As National Co-Chair for the Financial Services Group at Baker Hostetler, Mr. Sherritt has extensive knowledge of banking, mortgage, credit union, and specialty finance industries. As a former regulator, he assists clients in litigation and assists compliance managers and staff on all sorts of issues related to CFPB readiness. Mr. Hoffman is a leading member of the firm's privacy and data protection team. He provides counsel on complex regulatory issues from data collection and usage, customer communications, emerging payments, cross-border transfers, and security incident response. He has guided clients through hundreds of security incidents and provides a practical approach to meet business goals. Mr. Hoffman will take you through the current financial services industry landscape and all sorts of challenges with cybersecurity incidents and data compromises. He will also discuss key considerations in developing an effective incident response plan and the key challenges and ongoing management considerations that go along with that. Mr. Sherritt will then discuss best practices for ongoing training, diligence, and oversight. As for some housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. We will have a 10 to 15-minute question and answer period at the end, so feel free to raise your hand and type in any questions throughout the presentation in the box, and we will address all of those questions at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Craig and Anthony to take you through what I hope is a very informative presentation.
Thank you. Hi, this is Craig Hoffman. I'm a partner in Baker's Cincinnati office. Our security incident response practice has helped clients respond to over 1,000 potential security incidents. And our view is, because of the number of incidents we've seen, it doesn't mean we always know the right answer or how to handle every incident, but because we've seen so many, we kind of work through these issues and are pretty well positioned to help companies anticipate what is likely to come their way and reduce the level of anxiety and be in a better position to respond. And a few years ago, when we worked with companies, a lot of companies would say, we don't have to be prepared, this kind of issue won't happen to us. And I think now the pendulum has completely swung the other way. Companies now generally accept that they're going to have incidents and may have multiple incidents each year. And our view on this is, because you're not going to be always able to stop every incident, you have to be ready to respond. And so you certainly still have to have the right security measures in place, but you also have to have the detective measures in place so you find incidents faster and you're better positioned to contain the incident and then work through the communication phase if necessary. And I think, as we'll see later in some of the communication slides, anymore the issues are not so much the fact that you've had an incident. The reputational impact is more severe when you are viewed as not handling the incident well. And in our experience, not handling the incident well usually is driven by not being prepared. And so on this slide, we've identified what we think are the key elements of preparedness. So not just technical security, but awareness and training. I think today one of the most prominent awareness and training measures that financial institutions are concerned with are phishing training, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but also understanding your broader security posture and then just knowing where your sensitive data is. It's hard to guard and detect when someone's trying to get to your sensitive data if you don't know what systems they're on, what vendors have access to that data. And then I'm sure everyone's heard this over and over, you need to have an incident response plan, and you should be testing it. And also, because these issues and the threats change frequently, you do have to have kind of ongoing diligence to be prepared for these issues. And so in 2016, our team helped companies respond to about 300 incidents. We looked back and identified across those incidents what were the most common causes. And in a lot of them, it was kind of hard to single out whether the attack was a result of an employee mistake or inaction or an external attacker. And in some ways, if you combine the two causes of phishing, hacking, and malware, and employee action or mistake, because there's usually some employee component involved in allowing a phishing, hacking, or malware scenario to be successful, you can see that over half of the incidents we encountered in some way related to an employee or underlying action or inaction. And so I think that highlights, and Anthony will talk about this more later, the importance of employee awareness and training. And one other notable piece from this, the amount of instances caused by true malicious internal employees is smaller than I think a lot of people expect. And also, we continue to see a drop. I think years ago, the lost or improper disposal slide would have showed a higher frequency of that being a cause, especially for banks losing backup tapes with encryption, both on backup tapes or changing how you do backups and encrypting other portable devices. We're seeing that cause drop in frequency. When you look at the phishing cause, you can find lots of studies out there, whether you pick PhishMe or the security firms. They continue to say that a lot of the incidents they respond to are caused in some way that starts with a phishing attack. And what we've seen and heard from these forensic firms is it's not just the run-of-the-mill attackers, and it's not just the financially motivated attackers, and it's not just the nation-state sponsored attackers. All of the different attacker groups are often using phishing as one of the first ways to gain entry. And I think it's just easier for them to trick people into giving them the toehold into the environment than it is to try to find ways to get past your web applications or some other way in that they've used in the past. If you can trick one person, then they can introduce tools to expand their access in the environment, do reconnaissance, and then expand their capabilities in your environment. The common belief is that most phishing emails have a link, and if you open the email and click a link, that's what causes the issue. We see, and companies continue to report on, a variety of ways that the phishing messages introduce the malware. One of the most common is a document attached. On some recent financially motivated attacks on merchants, it was simply an invoice attached to an email that said, you owe us $1,313, please open the invoice. And when you open the invoice and you enable macros on the Word document, that launched the malware. We also see it come in the terms of a PDF that looks like a fax, or even a voicemail message that comes to you as an audio file. So in the awareness training, just remember that it's not going to be just the classic Nigerian Prince email with a link where you click on it. There are a lot of different ways that attackers are using to trick you to introduce the malware through their phishing message. One other comment on the overall response life cycle that comes from our security incident response report, and I think for me in identifying level of preparedness and where to focus your preparedness efforts, this is to me the most important finding that came out of our look back, because it shows you the overall life cycle. And in our occurrences, we had across the incidents on average 69 days from the time the issue first started until the company became aware of that. And I think that's probably pushed a little lower because a fair amount of the incidents were healthcare incidents where, if a nurse talks about a patient in front of other people, that is an incident and they know about it right away. So if you remove those, our length of time from attack to discovery would be larger. I'm just going to jump ahead and look at an example from a security firm we work with, Mandiant, in their 2016 report, they identified if the company self-detected the issue, the company would self-detect it usually on average within 56 days of it occurring. If it wasn't self-detected, it took on average 320 days for a third party to notify the company. And what I think this shows is the importance of detective capabilities and the amount of focus you have to have on keeping good forensic data. So not just keeping it long enough, to have it available if an attack did start 320 days ago and you didn't detect it, but also making sure you have the right forensic data. So if you have logs but they don't contain the details your security firm needs to investigate the attack, you're only going to get a partial story. And a lot of times what we hear from forensic firms is because the available forensic data wasn't as good as they needed it to be, they could determine that an attacker broke into the environment. They could see the capabilities the attacker gained, and they could tell you that the attacker gained capabilities that gave them the ability to take whatever data they wanted. But because of the insufficiency of the forensic data, they couldn't identify with specificity what was taken or what was not taken. And a lot of times that pushes companies to err on the side of caution, assume the worst case scenario occurred, and notify a broader group of people. Because on the other hand, they're worried if they don't notify that broad group, something like what happened with LinkedIn occurs, where LinkedIn said this incident only affected a small number of emails, and then a few years later someone posts a much larger group of emails online and people recognize that the company underreported the significance of the incident. And so one area where we definitely see an ability to improve by companies is in the ability to detect an issue. And then the next place where we can see improvement is when you first become aware of the incident, getting from awareness of a potential issue to learning enough about the incident to contain it and stop it. And on average, it took companies we worked with 7 days to reach that containment point. And while it might look like 7 days is pretty fast, when you're going through a significant potential issue, 7 days seems like a long time, especially if you're getting inquiries from your customers, or if you're getting regulatory questions, or if you're getting third parties reporting, like Brian Krebs, that he's aware of a potential issue. 7 days to get from you're possibly aware of something to knowing generally what occurred and stopping it is a long time, and it's fraught with a lot of anxiety when you're not able to know enough to lock out the attacker. And so part of that effort to improve on containment is having pre-engaged with a forensic firm, so knowing what firm you will use, and going beyond just knowing the firm you will use, but also negotiating your master services agreement with them ahead of time. Nothing's more frustrating to a company than calling up a firm and saying, we need help, please start work. And they say, great, here's our master services agreement. You send it to your internal legal counsel. And because we're attorneys, we can't just accept something on its face. We need to redline it. So we're going to change choice of law, negotiate for better limits of liability, and other changes. And after 2 or 3 days of red lines going back and forth, you finally reach an agreement, and then the firm's ready to start. And so you've now lost 2 or 3 days of effort to get that firm started. We also see companies going beyond just pre-engaging into doing preparedness exercises where they talk about their network. They understand how their system is set up and what forensic data they have, what logs, how to connect to their SIM, and they get into the details of the logs they're sending to their SIM so that they make sure the forensic firm will have the data it needs to do the investigation. The other piece of this that's important is the timing to completion and notification. And you'll see in a lot of scenarios we're doing notification before the investigation was fully complete. And by complete, we mean we have basically a written report. And so because of the effort to try and do notice as soon as possible, when we reach a point where the forensic firm says they've completed their analysis, they have nothing left to look at, we're doing notice before we get their written report to try and get it out a little faster. And then when you look at surveys from third parties that talk to CISOs at companies and say, if you have a significant issue, how fast do you think you would detect it? CISOs and security professionals are still saying, basically, we would see it in 1 or 2 days. The majority of companies say that for a significant issue, they're going to see it that fast. And when you look back at Mandiant's report or even ours, companies aren't detecting these significant issues that fast. And I think the best way I have to try and explain this difference in viewpoint is CISOs and security professionals at companies are seeing hundreds of incidents a year, and for a lot of them, they are seeing them within a day, 2 days, or 3 days, and they're catching them and stopping them and remediating them. But because security teams are comprised of people, and people make mistakes, and whether it's your people or your vendors, in those 1 or 2 that get past the goalie, those are the issues that you're not catching in 48 or 72 hours. Those are the ones that are lasting a long time undetected, and that's where you come into the challenges you face of not only being able to figure out what happened when these issues have started so long ago, but it's also you're missing an opportunity to mitigate the potential consequences of those issues. And so for those scenarios where something does get by the goalie and you're forced to respond, everyone's, I'm sure, been told they need an incident response plan, and we've seen these plans range from a few small pages to 70 pages of a core plan with multiple appendices attached, and they come in big, thick 3-ring binders. And in practice, across over 1,000 incidents we've worked on, I don't think I've ever worked with a company where on day 5 of the incident, they put out their incident response plan and said, we're on day 5, it's 12 o'clock, that means we should be doing section 2A, parts 1 and 2. I think the biggest value of having an incident response plan is that in the process of building it, you identify the team, you identify your third parties, you come up with a triage system for how you're going to involve the broader team when necessary. Maybe a level 1 incident just stays with the security team, but for a level 2, it gets escalated to the core incident response team, and then a level 3.
Yeah, Craig, what I'd like to do is just take a brief pause here, and because I think you've made some really interesting points on incident detection and the time duration it takes between initial detection and containment and discovery notification. So let's just kind of get our audience here to weigh in a little bit on this, and if you guys could just kind of answer these questions and answer whether or not your organization has experienced some sort of a data breach, yes or no. So waiting for everybody to take a moment here and weigh in on this, and we'll get a gauge of how pervasive the folks on the call have experienced these sorts of incidents in their own organizations. Hoping everybody has a chance to just click. And the second question we'd like to get everybody to weigh in on is, if you have experienced some sort of a data breach, how quickly was it detected within your organization? Was it over a week, under a week, within 72 hours, or within 48 hours? So if you guys could answer that question. What was interesting too about the first question, we found that 31% of our participants on the call have experienced some sort of a data breach or incident. 69% were not aware of anything.
Which I do think that's interesting, because any security conference you go to, you hear people say there are 2 types of companies that have been compromised and companies that don't know they've already been compromised. I think a third seems a little low, but it's certainly within, I think, the parameters of expectation based on the sample size we have. Mm-hmm. I know the other poll was for those who did have an incident, how fast was it detected? And it looks like the leading answer right now is 43% detected within 48 hours of the occurrence, which I think if we're dealing with, if you define an incident as a piece of malware on one person's computer or any other potential issue, mm-hmm. I think that's understandable that you find it that fast.
Yeah, essentially the folks on the call, we had 43% had detected it within 48 hours, which that's actually pretty good. We had about another 14% detected it within 72 hours, and 25% was within a week, and then 18%, which is more than 1 out of 5, it took over more than 1 week. Interesting.
That's consistent with what companies report to third parties, and for significant issues, different than the usual lag time of anywhere between 50 to almost a year from
and
attack
most importantly,
discovery.
what we'd like to do is, as you said, Craig, is what are you doing about it? So the last question we had for the group was, did this detection time cause you to change aspects of your incident response preparedness plan? Yes or no? So again, hope everybody on the call weighs in on this one and cast their vote. I'm going to just keep the poll open a couple more seconds, and we'll see what how many organizations made any sorts of changes to their incident response preparedness plan. And what's interesting here is 64% are actually saying no. They made no changes at all, and actually it was 63%, and 38% said yes, they did make some changes to their plan.
And if you,
Craig, is that something you would see typical given your experience with the industry?
I don't think it's surprising. So if you go through an incident and you use this kind of incident response plan method that you borrow from NIST, one of the last steps is after the incident, look back at what occurred and determine if there are any places where you need to improve. And for the day-to-day issues, it's probably not identifying something where you needed to do something different. Usually the time we see companies go back and modify their plan is when it's been a significant issue and they've identified, and usually the gaps aren't necessarily on the run book, kind of, if we have a DDoS attack, these are the 4 steps we're going to take. It's usually more on, we didn't involve our risk management team so that they could put our cyber liability carrier on notice, or we didn't involve communications early enough, and they were doing one thing while the security team was working on the response, or legal didn't know security was aware of a potential issue, and when they went to calculate kind of the amount of time from detection and learning of the incident to determine how fast they should notify, they learned that security had learned of this a couple weeks ago, and so they had less time available than they thought. So it's usually out of the larger problems when we see companies go back and change their plans. One thing I did want to notify, and I want to jump through these somewhat quickly and get into a couple of the communication slides before turning it over to Anthony. The FFIEC kind of cybersecurity self-assessments that financial institutions are going through, when you look at the resiliency and when you look at the incident response planning kind of stages that determine where you're at in terms of level of maturity, I think it's very difficult for companies to hit the advanced or innovative phases, and a lot of the companies we're working with are kind of placing themselves, at least now, up front, kind of in the evolving or even intermediate area. And when you look at what it takes on both the resiliency side and the incident response side to go past the intermediate phase, it basically means you are doing incident response weekly or more to make it that kind of automated level, and not every financial institution is going to have that many opportunities where it needs to be or has enough experience to reach kind of the phases beyond the intermediate maturity level. Another quick note before communications, there's been a lot of discussion about the attacks on some of the foreign banks misusing their SWIFT credentials, and the concern here for either misusing SWIFT or FedWire accounts. And the security firms I've talked to, one of which has investigated some of those attacks, the measures they've kind of described for how banks can guard against this is somewhat similar to what retailers are asked to do with their payment card environment. It's kind of treat your credentials and your system for transfers as a separate segmented system, and make sure you limit the amount of people who have access to it, monitor their credentials and their use of the credentials, so you can see when there is an issue and catch it faster. Segmentation, I think, sometimes is easier said than done, but looking at what occurred in those issues and coming out of it, those are the recommendations they were making to us. The other part that you see, and I think it comes out in some of the challenges you see companies have, is how does the legal team, the compliance, the risk management, and security team, how do they interact with management on these issues? What's the role of management in the board in terms of oversight? And I think there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I do think we have to be beyond the phase where, if you talk to some attorneys, they'll say, I went to law school because I was bad at math. I don't think you can really afford to have leadership say cybersecurity and all of that, that's a really technical issue, and I don't have to understand that because we're going to hire really smart people. I think there has to be a minimum level of understanding of what the risk is so you can properly exercise oversight and management responsibility. And I think if you just treat it as kind of a specialist issue and don't get involved and learn about it, it doesn't convey an appropriate level of importance to really foster the right kind of behavior across the company and treating how important security is across the company. And so some examples management can take to exercise that kind of oversight and to show the right focus. We've listed some of those here, and it ranges from having a committee that exercises oversight over that issue to making sure you just have the right roles at the company, dedicating someone to security and privacy, down to understanding that this risk does cause financial consequences and evaluating your ability to shift that risk through cyber liability insurance. Really quick before handing it over to Anthony, some of the don'ts we list here, you can look back at incidents companies have faced and how they've responded and pick out the ones that probably give you those examples. If you have an incident and you're getting called to talk about it publicly before you're ready, before you've really done your forensic investigation, saying you know what occurred is likely to put you in the scenario kind of like Target was, where it said it was only 40 million payment cards and no other data. And then 6 weeks later when the forensics finished, they said, oh, by the way, 70 million names and emails were also stolen. So along the way, the goal is to reach a point when you do your notification where you've finished the investigation, you've stopped the attack, you've identified what occurred, what you're doing to protect the people who are affected by the incident, and what you're doing to make sure the incident won't occur again. Those are kind of the 4 key questions people want to know. And when you can answer those questions, it puts you in a better position to have them understand what occurred. They won't be happy that it occurred, but they're not going to look at you as not having responded in an appropriate way. In some ways, that's kind of the best you can do when you have one of these issues. You can't undo it, but you can at least not have people think you didn't handle the incident well, on top of allowing the incident to occur.
Interesting to see how companies should put those management action plans together in terms of how they address these sorts of incidents. Now we'd like to kind of poll the audience again, and we're going to ask a couple other questions on sort of what kinds of what has their organization done in terms of providing cybersecurity training to their employees. You know, kind of getting at Craig's point about what management needs to be doing and ensuring everybody is cyber ready. So why don't you guys take a moment and just kind of vote as to whether or not your organization currently is providing cybersecurity training to your employees. Yes or no? We're going to keep this poll open for about a minute to give everybody a chance to cast their vote, and we'll get a sense of how this group today is currently ensuring that their employees are prepared and know how to detect these types of incidents and respond accordingly. Okay, so right now we're seeing about 92% of the people said yes, their organization does provide cybersecurity training, and 8% say no. So that's actually really great to see, don't you think, Anthony?
It is, and thanks very much for turning this over to me. And Craig, thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd like to just a couple other questions, Anthony, we want to get the audience to weigh in on. The second question was, if you do provide cybersecurity training, has it changed from the prior year? Has your training stayed the same as last year, increased slightly from last year, or more than doubled from prior year? So if you could just vote on what level of training changes you've seen between this year and last. So just take a moment for all of the participants to let us know. Oh, interesting there. We're seeing about 25% of the folks on the call, their training has stayed the same as last year. Another 55% have increased their training in this area more than last year, and 20% the training investment has more than doubled from last year as it relates to cybersecurity readiness. So what do you think about that, Anthony? Would that be something you would have expected given the environment today?
I think so. I think that's about right. Yeah, I would say that that's about right.
Okay, and then we just had one more question we wanted to ask the group, and that also relates to training, and it's more around, do you plan on increasing your cybersecurity training in the future? Yes or no? So if everybody could just take a moment to answer that question, and then we can see what the findings are, and Anthony can then take over and share with us some of the management and training considerations that folks should consider. Got it. We'll keep it open for another second. Okay, here are the results. What we're finding right now is 88% of the folks on the call do plan on increasing their cybersecurity training in the future, and 12% of the folks say no, they do not plan on increasing their training. Okay, so Anthony, on that ado, I'll hand it over to you, and you can kind of take us through your section of the webinar.
Thank you, and could you just confirm that you can see my slides?
I am not seeing your slides, Anthony, right now. I'm seeing your desk.
Okay.
So, Craig, perhaps could you move, change the presenter to Anthony? Okay. You should be now presenter now. Anthony?
Can you see it now?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
You could just put it in presentation.
Okay, great.
There. That's perfect. And you could just maximize that. I do see the window on the top. Close the other window. Yeah.
Is it maximized now?
No. I'm still seeing there. Yes, it is now. Okay. Go back. Okay. Oh.
How about now?
It's still, yeah, just, oh, there we go. We're good to go. Wonderful.
Are we good? Are we good now?
Perhaps, yeah, that's perfect. And maybe you could share a little bit of your experience on training implications for managers and employees.
Great. So thanks so much. You know, and then Craig, thanks for your great overview. I'm going to be talking about three things today in the time that we have left. The first is going to be training of employees on many of the things that Craig discussed. I'm also going to talk a little bit about vendor oversight for those of you that have vendors that may be helping you monitor cybersecurity issues. And then we're going to get into a little bit of regulatory enforcement and litigation matters that can impact your companies from a cybersecurity perspective. But nothing that Craig talked about today can really be properly implemented without the proper training of the key employees and managers. And when we talk about training, we're really talking about two types of training. One is training from an internal perspective. Again, having key IT personnel train key employees that may be impacted by a cybersecurity threat. And by the way, that's really all employees that work for the company. And number two, possibly having external professionals come in, either from consulting companies, law firms, and the like, that can help train you on being compromise ready. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. One of the last things I'll say before I move forward with this slide is we need to ensure that training is also done at not just the frontline level, but that both managers and perhaps sometimes C-suite executives are also made aware of the training opportunities available in the cybersecurity space. Now, we know that to train our hired staff to provide continuous monitoring is really important. And what do we mean by that? There is a bit of analytic tools that are out there that are available. Craig discussed a lot of that in his presentation. And so whenever you're going to be training your employees in the cybersecurity space, we want to ensure that it is coupled with a risk assessment. And what do I mean by that? Many times training is, well, most times training is not a one-size-fits-all as it relates to cybersecurity, and rather training must be properly scoped with the level of risk that is associated with your company. The level of cybersecurity risk at a large $20 or $30 billion financial institution is going to be altogether different from the type of training that's necessary for a mid-sized non-bank lender. And so we must be aware of that. We also, training is also aimed at preventing the exfiltration of data at the points. And so when malware is found on the network, Craig talked about that, but that's really a key component. We also want to talk about when training should occur. Again, being compromise ready is thinking about things before a cybersecurity threat occurs. And so we want to make sure that training happens at the time of hiring, not necessarily after somebody is hired, or certainly not after a cybersecurity incident has occurred. At that point, it's likely too late. And so what we advise and we counsel our clients to train their employees on cybersecurity problems, issues, and risks at the time of hiring. And because for our clients that do that, we find that they significantly mitigate their risk, and we'll talk about why that is here in a few slides. Training should also not be happen on one occurrence. Rather, it should be ongoing and continuous. The reason it should be ongoing and continuous is because the fraudsters out there are constantly thinking of new ways to propose cybersecurity threats. And this is particularly true for financial services companies, for which many of you represent that are listing here today. And so
that's interesting. I'm going to ask you if you would advance your slide, because I'm still seeing the one on training managers and employees.
Okay.
So if you could kindly just advance it forward.
Okay, 1 second. Did that change it?
No, I'm still seeing the same slide.
Okay.
So
1 second.
you just use your mouse. That might make it easier.
I am. Are you still seeing the first line?
Yes, I am seeing the first one. And if you'd
All right.
like,
how about now?
No, okay. Now I'm seeing, no, that's exactly where you were, and I'm seeing the new one now. This is great.
Okay. All right,
the
very good.
importance of the timing of that training for new hires and ongoing training. I'm seeing that slide right now.
Okay, great. And so, yeah, so initial training at the time of hiring is very important. And we also talked about informal training as well. Here is a sample of what can be sent out with respect to updating of computer information that may be on employees' computers. One of the things that we know is a risk area for companies is this. Many times when IT is to amend some of the training of some of the protocols when it comes to computer security, many times emails are sent out to employees, but the problem is that many times those emails are ignored. And so part of training should be to counsel your employees to ensure that when emails like this come out from IT personnel, that they aren't just discarded, not read, and sent to the trash, but are actually reviewed, because many of these security measures that are sent out by IT personnel are critical to protecting the company. Now, this is an interesting slide here, and let's talk about this. I think many times that who actually clicks on malicious messages is really important within various companies. And so this slide shows that the legal department and senior executives, by and large, are not the individuals that click on malicious messages, but in fact, it's really the people in the sales department, finance, and supply chain. And why is that? That is because sales individual studies show really work in a fast-paced environment. They are constantly looking to increase the bottom line for the company because that's what they've been hired to do. But because of that and because of the expediency of their work, they tend to be more risky when it comes to cybersecurity threats. I also want to pause right here and talk about those of you that may work in the Human Resources Department. That is also a high-risk area when it comes to cybersecurity threats, particularly as it relates to malicious messages. This is really important because we've counseled various clients that have had significant cybersecurity issues because HR personnel clicked on malicious software that ended up sending proprietary, personal, or confidential information of employees to either fraudsters or people that should not have received it. And so this is really important here. And so just make sure that HR personnel are on the front lines of being trained, because they really can present a significant risk area when it comes to some of these factors. Let's talk about the types of risk and threats that are here, and I know Craig touched upon this, so we'll talk about this briefly. But we're really talking about phishing at 71%, unpatched vulnerabilities at 50%, and then you can see some of the other things. Now, I want to pause right here as well. Note that only 18% of the risk and threats as a result of the source that was provided by the Department of Homeland Security, only 18% of the risk and threats are from what's called advanced persistent threats, or sophisticated network attacks. I know many of us who go to the movies like I do and are movie buffs, many times we see that these advanced persistent threats are really the source of world domination in the movies and can cause significant harms to businesses throughout the United States. But in reality, those advanced persistent threats are not really what causes many of our industries to see cybersecurity issues at the forefront of their businesses. It's really some of the more mundane, what appear to be more innocent threats that actually can cause the most harm, and studies bear that out. Now, as part of any type of planning or training a program, a risk assessment must be conducted, and we talked about this. Penetration tests must occur if you're going to do this properly as well. My brother, who actually works for a Global 20 company, this is his job in its entirety. He works in the disaster recovery unit for a global company, and they are constantly replicating cybersecurity issues and constantly conducting penetration tests. And so we advise that those of you that are working in the IT departments that are on the phone today, irrespective of the size of your company, that you conduct these tests before anything arises. Now, I would be remiss if I did not talk about vendor management and vendor security when it comes to cybersecurity oversight. We talked about sort of the target breach earlier. You'll see a chart here that shows how, the timeline of how things can occur. And certainly those of you that work for more sophisticated companies may have vendors that may be implicated or involved in a cybersecurity threat, and so it's critical that you are constantly auditing, monitoring the vendors that participate in the information technology space for your respective companies, because vendors can unfortunately play a huge role when it comes to the incidents that can occur and perhaps for lack of awareness. Now, as a former regulator, I would also be remiss if I didn't talk about regulator hot buttons when it comes to cyber security. And as many of us have seen, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau recently took action in the Dwala case against a company that, at least in the CFPB's eyes, failed to actually live up to its protections that it said that it had in place to keep consumers safe by protecting their consumer data. So, it's not just an issue of state regulators that can certainly bring enforcement actions against companies for lack of cybersecurity, and also we know that states' attorneys generals can as well. But now the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has let everyone know that it will be taking action against companies that have failed to either put proper cybersecurity measures in place, or number two, failed to adhere to the procedures that it said it had in place in the first place. That's really important. And as you can see here, we see some other regulator hot buttons when it comes to absence of appropriate policies or procedures and insufficient training. Let me pause quickly and talk about policies and procedures. We counsel our clients to not put policies or procedures in place in the cybersecurity space that either the company does not have the capacity to adhere to or just has no plans to adhere to. And so that is a regulator's no-no. So in other words, if you actually are going to adhere to a cybersecurity policy, then go ahead and put that in writing. But if you have no intent of doing it, or you just don't have the capacity to do it, don't put that in your policy, because it will certainly be checked by the regulators. In the interest of time, we're going to keep going here, because I think cyber liability coverage is really critical, and I know that Craig counsels clients routinely, as do I, from a regulatory and compliance perspective regarding cybersecurity coverage. We know that cybersecurity coverage is really something that every company should have. Particularly companies that are in the financial services industry. Incident response costs are on the rise, and we'll see a slide about that later. There are computer forensic costs that can be implicated, and of course cybersecurity coverage can also, through a rider or otherwise, provide identity protection, and also it can cover crisis management if the cybersecurity threat is so severe that it requires that. You should also, for those of you that have cyber liability coverage in place, it should be evaluated periodically, at least annually, because as we've seen, you want to make sure that you're actually adequately protected because we know that costs are on the rise. Your cybersecurity and cyber liability coverage should also include defense or litigation costs that are borne out of incidents or cybersecurity incidents that you could incur. Private litigation by consumers or current or former employees is often spawned out of a cyber security incident, and your cyber liability coverage can actually cover that. Now let's talk about the increasing cost of data breaches, and I know Craig talked about this earlier, but it's really important. There are both direct, and this slide shows both direct and indirect per capita data breach costs over the last 10 years. And so as we can see, those costs tend to be on the rise. We had a big year in 2011, but just know that because of these costs, cyber liability coverage is really critical. Now let's talk about the financial services industry in particular, because we know that's where most of you come from that are listening here today. The per capita cost by industry classification is shown here. And just know that from this study from the Ponemon Institute back in 2015 shows that the financial services industry has the third highest per capita cost of incidents and data breach incidents by industry. So this is why you need to evaluate your cyber liability coverage. I think this chart illustrates it all. What are some other key issues to think about from your cyber liability coverage? Choice of counsel. Many times, if you have coverage, the company cannot choose the counsel that it wants to utilize. Rather, it's that counsel is chosen for them by the company that is providing coverage, the insurance company. So if you don't like that, be sure that you negotiate that term with the provider of the insurance over the company. One of the last things I want to talk about is, the incident of class action claims. Our law firm handles a wide variety of data breach class action claims on a national basis, and we know that class litigation is on the rise generally, and class litigation in the data and cybersecurity breach space is on significantly on the significant rise. And here are some of the claims that can be brought in a cybersecurity data breach class action. Negligence claims are often brought. There's usually a breach of fiduciary duty claim. There are going to be claims that tend to be brought under state consumer fraud statutes and under state notification statutes. Hopefully most of you know that if you have a significant data breach, most states have a requirement that you actually notify a state agency or the state attorney general of that breach within a short period of time of gaining knowledge of the breach. And if you don't do that, many times private litigants can bring a private right of action based upon the failure to do that. So these class actions can actually be in the millions.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. Very interesting presentation. Both you and Craig have shared with us today. We've definitely seen some interesting examples of the complexity of cybersecurity and the challenges that financial institutions are facing. We've certainly learned that cybersecurity threats are on the rise and the cost associated with those as well. We've learned that it's becoming more and more difficult to detect and see the complexity of the environment, the importance of creating an effective incident response plan. I think you guys have shared some really great tips on how to monitor this space and continually keep abreast of updating and training employees and how important that is, that they're up to speed on what to be looking for and how to address it. And lastly, I think it's been great to learn more about some of the best practices for ongoing enforcement of these policies. So without further ado, we've got about 3 minutes left, and before I'd open it up to questions, I just want to call out a few resources there on the prior slide. Anthony, if you could just share your good ways to keep abreast of things is to follow the blogs for both Craig and Anthony. They're up there on the screen right now. You can see their contact information as well as their Twitter. And then also OnCourse Learning. We have, follow our blog as well, and, our LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. My email is there as well if anybody would like to email me direct. And also OnCourse Learning provides training courses on cybersecurity, specifically on cyber readiness and social media implications. And we also provide training on vendor management, an area that Anthony had touched on. So now what I'd like to do, we've received 4 questions, and if there's any more folks, please share them now. Anthony, I did have a question for you, and that was along the lines of, should training be conducted by internal personnel or by outside vendors?
That's a great question, and I think it really depends upon the expertise of the people internally. Certainly, if you have some IT personnel that are going beyond just sort of the day-to-day activities, but are actually staying abreast of emerging issues in cybersecurity, they're going to the conferences that they need to go to, and are well read and have the ability to communicate best practices to their employees, then certainly internal training should occur, and it should occur anyway because regulators want to see that. So internal training should almost always occur. But if you find that you don't have the expertise internally to conduct all the training that we need to, as discussed today, then certainly going to an outside vendor that has expertise is something that should be done in conjunction with the internal training that occurs on cybersecurity threats and data breach incidents.
Okay, thank you. The next question we had, Craig, I think might fall more within your area. The question is, how do companies actually use their incident response plan during an incident?
I think the best use of the incident response plan during the incident is the result of the upfront work you do building it and testing it. People respond instinctively. The incident response team is known. The type of incident, people just kind of launch into action because they've practiced it, because they know their role. Occasionally, you see people kind of look at the core resources in it that identify your third parties, and you pull it out to contact them. But if you're kind of at a disadvantage if you're just pulling out your incident response plan when you detect an incident and reading through it to say, okay, what do we do now? The value really is building it ahead of time and practicing it so that when you do detect something, you respond more out of trained instinct than out of book learning.
Great. And I think we've got time for one more question. And that last question, I think, Craig, would be for you. Would be, how should companies develop table-type exercises to test their plans?
We do probably 50 tabletops a year, and we kind of take the law and order approach where we kind of take incidents ripped from the headlines and tailor them to the company. So whether it's someone using a scenario like the SWIFT bank attacks or borrowing something that has affected healthcare entities lately, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it move over to retailers or financial institutions, which is the morphing of ransomware that affects one device to someone getting into a network, deleting backup files, and then launching ransomware to a broader set of devices across the organization. So those are two of the scenarios we've used in the last couple of weeks to test financial institutions' incident response plans.
Okay, great. No, thank you. And we have one more question that just came in, and that question is, how often a penetration test should be conducted? Are you able to address that, Craig or Anthony?
It depends on what applications you want to test. If you're a retailer and you have payment card data that you have to protect, they're required to do quarterly scans of their web applications and then at least do an annual pen test. So I think it's kind of looking at the size of the organization, how much you manage versus how much your vendors manage, and getting a level of comfort on how often you want to do that. But I think most people would say do it at least annually.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you. Well, I think we've run out of time in terms of questions. I want to thank everybody for attending. And if any of you have any further questions or would like a copy of this webinar, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is here on the screen. You can shoot me an email. And I want to thank everybody for coming. We hope you've enjoyed this session today and appreciate your sharing your lunchtime hour with us. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.